Parce que le cinéma, c'est un meeting permanent avec le public. Dans une salle de cinéma, vous avez catholiques, musulmans, gaullistes, communistes et tout ça. Quand le film est bon, chacun perçoit et accepte ce qu'il est.
But I have written all kinds of stories. I mean, humorous stories, stories about people not fantastic, very normal people.
Dans de la Casbah, la France est votre patrie. Allez, montrez.
I feel like I can't see myself. Can you see me? Sometimes your gaze feels eerie. Like I don't show up in the mirror sometimes. But I know I'm here. I can hear myself. I can feel myself. But I can't see myself sometimes. Can you see me?
On my mother's side, my family comes from the place that's called La Antigua Veracruz, which is the first place that the colonizers settled in Mexico before they drove into Mexico City and took it over.
Well, I am an interesting person because I'm 100% Indian. My dad is from North India, Punjab, and my mom, she is Indian, but she's fourth generation Guyanese. So she's Caribbean.
So my mom's side is from Palestine. We're from a small village in like the northwestern part of Palestine. Modern day, like it's known as like the 1948 territories, like what's currently known as Israel.
My family's from Nigeria.
My family's both from Ife and Ibadan, which is in Nigeria. And it feels like home, I think.
The culture is definitely something we love, we cherish.
Her mother told her there's a lot of beaches and stuff like that, and a lot of beautiful things that she remembers, like the mosque that was like a few blocks down that they'd pray at and stuff like that, and it was really just beautiful, and it really inspires me to go back.
Like my mom, you know, we listen to soca music, we listen to reggae music.
Our family is West African, it's also indigenous, and it's also Spanish.
There are over 300 languages in Nigeria and so many different tribes.
And so she's culturally Caribbean, right? And she doesn't know where her family is from in India. Her great-grandfather was born on a ship from India to Guyana, due to colonialism. It's very similar to the African-American experience, right? Like you don't really know where your ancestors are. It's very similar to how my mom grew up.
My understanding, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean and he landed in the island of Hispaniola, which is modern day Dominican Republic. The Spanish Empire at the time was undergoing a change where they were being free. Well, in their eyes, it was Muslim oppressors, but I think in reality, it was probably a lot more tolerable than what they say it was.
The plan for Zionism to occupy Palestine and stuff like that, people misconstrue it as starting around the 1940s, 1930s, when in reality, I think the first Zionist Congress happened either late 1800s or early 1900s, and the plans to colonize Palestine weren't even the first. The Zionists weren't considering Palestine to be the first place to colonize. They considered parts of East Africa. I think it was modern day Ethiopia or Kenya.
The British colonized Nigeria. So there's a lot of cultural things that are from the British. There's a high number of people that speak English.
I'm Yoruba, but the reason that English is the main language is because we were colonized by the British.
So basically during colonial times in India, right, the British rule, they controlled India as a resource hub.
The formation of the country, it was divided up by Europeans for resources, putting certain people in place to manage those resources and extract those resources from the people and send it back to the white power structure.
They began a series of pilgrimages in an attempt to find out more about the New World in order to make themselves richer.
They were Europeans, they might not be the same as the average Christian European, but at the end of the day, they were Europeans. But in order to justify their invasion or colonizing of Palestine, they could be hey, technically this is our land. Because of that, there were a lot of waves of immigration of Jewish Europeans into Palestine.
So the colonial history of where we're from is tied to the fact that a lot of conquistadors came into Mexico in order to make a better life for themselves. They were immigrants of sorts.
Like when the British would sail and conquer other places, they'd often make that their own home. But in India, this was more like viewed as a place to just pull resources out of it. So the Indian people had to live and make whatever ends meet they could under this British rule. They were getting more territories, whatever. And so Guyana was one of them through the slave trade. Really, it was all the Caribbeans were part of that, right? So then in India, it was basically indentured servitude, really, where Indians would sign up voluntarily, to go abroad. They left out of the port of Calcutta and Pondicherry, which is on the east side of India.
What is also not commonly depicted is that the people who were conquistadors were actually, they're all the bad stuff that Spain had to give, but they were also not just bad people. They were also, in their own ways, they were also victims of the system that Europe had at the time through feudalism. They were people who had lived impoverished for their entire lives, most likely worked as like indentured servants.
That caused a settler tension to rise between the natives, people that came like with the boats, the colonizers, like the Hebron massacre or something like that. Like things like these, they were built from tensions of like indigenous people saying, hey, we don't want to give our land back. European Jews coming, like suffering from some anti-Semitism, but some were coming saying that, they wanted to live in Palestine. Just like, you'll find that Palestinians are very, very, very welcoming. If you have a Palestinian friend you trust, if they bring you over to their food, you're leaving stuff. Like you're leaving like 10 pounds extra. Like I promise you, a Palestinian meal is a full and like
That's
very...
so black coded too. That's so like African American coded.
There's a lot of hospitality, like Black American culture and like Palestinian culture.
Individuellement, je préfère la littérature que le cinéma. Mais ça, c'est un luxe. De nos jours, la littérature est un luxe. Mais pour prendre le raccourci de l'histoire avec la tradition de l'oralité, le cinéma devient pour nous un outil important.
Yeah, my parents, they're both fluent in Yoruba, but when they were growing up, it was looked down upon to speak your native tongue in school.
There's different religions. I mean, the North is mainly Muslim and the South is generally Christian. Many different ethnic groups. We live in similar areas, but they're all put together around this border that was drawn for us.
So in India, there's a caste system.
So after Mexico began, Spain came in, they created a caste system.
But British really made the caste system something way worse than it was. The caste system was a system of societal roles, but it was always an equal plane, right? But when the British came in, they kind of turned that up onto a vertical plane. And so then there became this untouchable caste, which never existed.
I believe it placed actually the indigenous that were left at the bottom. But then they brought in African slaves. And so then they were placed at the bottom. And then they just created this whole caste system where mixing was allowed to an extent. But it was always, frowned upon for people of higher caste to be with lower caste.
Colonialism, what they do is they seek to pit people against each other. So they try to infiltrate and they say, okay, well, those Christians, you don't want to mess with them, or watch out for those Igbos or those Yoruba people. And then
those two groups that lived in that country, they really were kind of pinned against each other. So
you sow division, and then that allows people to be divided.
Oftentimes, a lot of these people that signed up to go abroad and try to find new opportunities were, deemed in these lower castes. And so they would end up getting on these ships to go, try to restart their lives.
It's the hospitality of a lot of indigenous cultures, to give, under capitalism, it's take, right? But under our cultures, it was, give, share. Sure, the model, Bella Hadid. So her father actually talked about this, where their family actually welcomed in, I think, Holocaust survivors at a point. Their family went to visit their family in another city. And when they come back, the locks were changed and they were essentially kicked out of their own home. There's a lot of hospitality that we gave towards Jewish migrants, and essentially their backs kind of turned on us. They had bought Palestinian land and fired the farmers.
So similar to Jamestown and settlements in the United States and like Native Americans instilling so much like love and hospitality and Thanksgiving.
And something else that, a lot of our colonial history is also dependent on is as the conquistadors went inland, they also spread their diseases. They also, obviously pillaged and raped. And so the people who were in Mexico just could not comprehend ideologically why their families were dropping dead left and right. Like it literally looked like to them that their gods had turned their back on them. And so this is where the conquistadors bringing in Christianity also stepped in to bring in that gap. And in modern day Veracruz and where my family's from, like we have huge reverence for the Catholic Church. And for me, it's always been an issue just because I understand the colonial history.
Christianity definitely was not like, there's a lot of other like religions within Nigeria. Christianity became a thing not because of, that wasn't innate to our culture in the beginning. Me as a Christian, I'm like thinking like, damn, like would I be a Christian if not for the British colonizing Nigeria?
They use that logic against us to like, because British, it doesn't mean that land wasn't ours, So funny because, for example, indigenous people in America, like, yes, they were never a nation state, but it's like they had their tribes and stuff like that, and they functioned as a society. You have to be an official nation state was used against us. Like, okay, Palestinians are never technically a people. When you can literally see in in Bibles from 1,000 years ago, it'll mention the word Palestine. Shakespeare had mentioned Palestine in one of his writings. Because of my standards, you don't really exist when their standards to begin with are not made in good faith. Like with Native Americans, like it's like, okay, the Lenape people of New York, it's sure they didn't have like a flag maybe or like something like that, but it's like you don't really need a flag, anything like that. To like, you're a people, you have culture, you have a land, you have food.
It's only because we feel pressure under this like you said, capitalistic way of building society that says we need these arbitrary signifiers of what it means to be a people and a culture and have a land.
Can you see me?
Sometimes.
Can you see me?
Your gaze feels like
I don't show up in the mirror sometimes.
Can you see me? I feel like.
But I know I'm
Can you see
here.
me?
I can hear myself. I can feel myself. But I can't see myself sometimes.
You can't unsee it nowadays. You really can't unsee it.
You can't go back once you're woken up. It's like, wow, like it's so in your face.
There's a term called like third culture kid. I'm a third culture kid, right? Because my parents both immigrated to here in America. So I didn't grow up in India. I didn't grow up in Guyana. And I'm, I'm even more than a third culture, because a lot of times third culture kids are like, okay, both their parents came from India, you're in America, and now like I'm this third culture in the middle. I don't really know what I am.
Right.
So for me, it's even crazier because both my parents are Indian, but my mom is coming from Guyana. So, I feel like my identity is so multifaceted, and it's so hard to feel represented.
Do you remember Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb?
When I watch it now, it's kind of like sad that probably meant a lot to like a lot of brown kids as well, because like that was the only representation that they had.
Yeah.
But the fact that the bar was so low that little brown boy had to be like every single stereotype of a brown boy that you could, compile into one character.
The classic like Indian nerd, or the Indian person that's never had any experiences before other than studying. That stereotype, which is often perpetuated by like non-Indian people, right? Non-Indian writers, they have struggled to find representation, I think, of like my experience in specific. But even like aspects of my culture, I think like, it's still not the greatest.
Jesse with Karen Barar, what's his name, Ravi? And it's like he also had an accent. It's like, damn, every single one of these brown characters, they just have to have an accent. I'm like, I don't want to like my very first exposure to brown people or like Arabs in media is like some really thick accent.
There's more stuff coming out now about like this third culture kid experience, right, of being like Indian in America, or like being born here. But to be honest with you, I don't think I've watched anything where I'm like, yeah.
There has been an increase in representation. I mean, sometimes when I think media representation, my mind goes to that On My Block scene, and she's like speaking broken English, and it's just, I mean, it's not the fact that the English isn't perfect, it's just the fact that like that is who they decided to depict as a Latina. Like when they had, like, it's literally in Los Angeles. Like,
Africans have this, perspective of Black Americans because of Western culture and how it's portrayed us in the media. People in Nigeria or like in Africa have this perception of Africans or African Americans of like, the ghetto, what is it, thugs, all these things. On the African American side, it's like, okay, these Africans are stuck up, they think they're better, blah, 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 all these things. Growing up in America and, when somebody looks at me, they perceive me, I am a Black woman, but that doesn't mean that my family went through the same generational traumas as a lot of Black families have.
And I think like Insecure is a prime example. Like Yvonne Orji is a Nigerian woman, Igbo, and she's playing an African-American woman, and they're portraying African-American experiences or the experiences that we have in this country in proximity to African-Americans.
Whenever I've seen like specifically like Nigerian Americans in media, obviously I definitely have a special feeling when I see that, because obviously it's not only somebody who I identify with like physically, but culturally understands a lot of like my background. And so when I see like an Yvonne Orji or a Lovey Ajayi, or that definitely is very empowering for me to see people who, again, have same culture as me. But also just Black women in general. I think like we are just so special. And so like no matter who we are, like our background, whenever I see us thriving, I'm like, oh my God, like this is who I want to be. It's like while we have like these cultural differences, at the end of the day, when a Black woman like shatters a ceiling, like that really opens it for any type of Black woman.
I think of us as different tribes in the diaspora. I think that a lot of us Africans, we assimilated into African-American culture.
It is even anything in our power that this like cloak of Blackness exists that strips us of our very unique and distinct cultural differences.
As I've grown older, I've seen Nigerians have had more of an impact on American culture. It's been beautiful to see that and to see it also embraced by the broader demographic. Like when I go to a club, I'll hear trap music and then I'll hear Afro beats also. And that blew my mind at first. I'm seeing memes and it's like, how the hell did y'all get access to the Nollywood films to like where are you running? That stuff like that. It's like, it's kind of crazy. She had this conversation with my coworker the other day. He's Muslim, I think he's from Saudi Arabia. And I was saying, what's that, brother? And it's like, he literally watches that imam. That was like an imam who's doing a sermon and he watches him.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in like the 1840s, I believe. That's when California, Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, like a lot of states were given to, well, not given, they were low-key kind of stolen. But that's when there began a whole media campaign to depict Mexican Americans in a specific light in order to create justification for the settlers to come in and take their land, because they knew that the people from Mexico would come into the United States, would work, and that they would also settle down and create a family. So then they started depicting Mexicans as pigeons. They said, the perfect Mexican is like a pigeon. They will come over here, they will work, and then they will return when it's time to hibernate.
Middle school, I was watching this trailer for the movie American Sniper. There was a scene in the trailer where like the American soldier is like pointing like a gun and like at someone. It was a little kid and a mom who was dressed in a very stereotypical like Islamic way, where it was like a burqa and her face was fully covered and stuff like that. And she gave her son like a bomb to carry all the way to like across. And the message behind that was basically like, look, like these Muslims or these Arabs, they give their children like bombs and they use them as human shields and send them across like to basically deliver bombs to like these like militants and stuff like that. And I remember seeing that. I was like, what, like 12, 11? And I was like, what the fuck?
Jarring to see how long that we've been dehumanized for. And when you're little, you don't really have the language for it. But when you look back, it almost makes me feel like robbed of a childhood. Almost like I had to sit here and endure this media that left me with so little humanity, while my counterparts that were shades lighter than me got to really just frolic, and you almost feel like you're making up for lost time now as a young adult with reclaiming how we've been painted, you know?
Before there was Coco, like the Disney movie, there was this movie called The Book of Life that was actually released by DreamWorks. Like Coco is almost like an explanation of what Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos is, like how the tradition is, and it's a beautiful story. But it's almost like geared towards like educating people about Mexican culture. Now, The Book of Life, on the other hand, that's literally just like being Mexican and having fun. To see like the mariachi versions of I'm a Creep by Radiohead, like it's just such a good movie. And it's like when you watch both movies, they have different feels. It feels like this is what we have to look like. But the other one, like Book of Life, is literally just Mexicans being Mexicans.
Yesterday I finished a Palestinian show. It's about an asylum seeker. What I love about the show is that it wasn't very like it wasn't trauma porn-esque. It wasn't like very forced the idea like, oh, what were we? It was like the realities, and also it showed like a couple laughs and stuff like that and good times. It was very focused on the identity and stuff like that, and it didn't feel forced. Like I feel like it was a double-edged sword sometimes with representation, where it's like either we're not represented or we're represented in a very, very caricature way, which is like, sure, yeah, I wanted like an Arab character or a South Asian character or a black character, but it's like this person is literally like forced Ebonics, forced thick Arab accent, forced the Indian accent. It just feels very weird.
Retrospect.
And having to navigate this experience of what it feels to be normalized in media and just like appear as is instead of appearing as like a caricature of yourself.
Like I've seen some like just new stuff and Indian artists who are performing in English fully, right? Like I mean Hanuman Kind I thought was really freaking dope. The song is called Big Dogs, but yeah, sick video. Like people are using it in America. It's not like, oh, this is an Indian artist. Like this song is just good, and then oh, it happens to be an Indian artist.
It's always like an underlying tone of like, this is what I think you as a person of color looks like, and this is what I will always think you look like. We can talk about Native American. Sometimes you can't tell that they're Native unless they come out wearing their regalia and like their traditional clothing. But that's also like not correct, because if you learn to associate people based off of a particular lens, then they're only in that identity while they're within that lens. So it's like me as a Mexican, like, sure, I can come out wearing the stereotypical poncho and like a fucking sombrero, but what's gonna happen when I take that off?
And I think that's where I really feel the most like heard, right? Where it's just like, we're Americans too now, right? Like whether we like it or not, we are. And so we're a part of this society, and like you don't need to highlight like, oh hey, this person, and you're like, we'll do that. We'll be like, oh shit, that guy's Indian, like that's fire. But like just rock with the music or rock with the art.